Next, we'll hear from Michael Kohan, who is, again, now flipping back more towards the demand side. Michael got her master's at the University of Alaska, and she worked for NOAA twice, interrupted by a stint as a Peace Corps volunteer. She then worked at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and now is at the Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute.
Thanks, Scott. And thanks, Linda and S&P, for having us here today. It is an honor to be able to represent Alaska, but I'm here today to really represent seafood in general and really address what we're talking about today, which is the challenge. So coming back to that demand side, understanding how we can do this in the United States. So this brings us to a global perspective of what Scott was saying earlier about our seafood consumption. This is FAO data from 2013, and this looks at global seafood production in the top bar graph, with every bar representing the top 100 countries in the world. And the bottom graph looks at seafood consumption, which is measured in grams of available seafood protein per day per capita. The red box outlines where the U.S. sits. So as you can see, for seafood production, the U.S. ranks 5th in the world. However, when you look at seafood consumption, we're ranked 80th. And I'd like to note, of the top seafood producing countries in the world, the US ranks the lowest in seafood consumption. So this is the issue that we're talking about today. And it's actually the reason, or one of the reasons, why ASME was formed almost 40 years ago. The state of Alaska and the Alaska seafood industry realized that there needed to be some invested funding and marketing influence to be able to support what that story is, what that narrative is, to be able to increase awareness, education, and outreach for understanding seafood and being able to increase consumption. And so this is what I want to talk about today briefly, is that with every marketing agenda, there's a story and there's a narrative, like Scott was saying. And it's our job to be able to promote that story. And I tell people I have the most honest job out there because I truly believe in the Alaska seafood story. And briefly, it's a story that really resonates with how to be able to really relay the origin of where our seafood comes from. It resonates with the cultural, social, and economic values of Alaskans. It's a product that's natural and has a unique intrinsic quality, taste, and nutritional aspect. And it's sustainable. Oh, I think the E got cut off. And that's because we're a role model for the globe on our sustainable fishing practices. So with all of this going for us, you'd think that my job would be easy. And although we've made successes in being able to market and promote Alaska seafood, both in our domestic and global markets, there are inherent challenges with being able to increase seafood consumption. And so when it comes to our largest market, we try to partner with our partners and collaborators to be able to address seafood consumption. And we really think that it is a collective effort from the seafood sector to be able to increase consumer demand, both farmed and wild, imported and domestic. Our biggest market is a U.S. market, and this is where we need to be able to have a more collective communication effort on how to be able to communicate seafood consumption to the nation. And then on this note, we also need to promote clear, factual, and consistent messaging. Too often there's so much confusion with seafood, whether it be the complexity of our supply chain, the myriad of seafood species, the distrust with labels in our food service and retail sectors. When the consumer is confused, they become a chicken consumer. And so this is where we need to be able to create some uniform messaging. I know when I came from my fisheries research and policy background into marketing, I was appalled at hearing the rhetoric that eating farmed salmon saved wild populations. This is obviously not true. We have production and harvest of our wild populations that is completely independent of the consumption of farmed seafood. And so it's this messaging that really breaks down the message from seafood in general. And that's where we promote confusion for the consumer, and in the end, we end up creating a chicken consumer. And so that's what we're here today to talk about. And Scott mentioned that he did some retail surveys with asking people at the seafood counter, and we do a little bit more sophisticated surveys with our consumers. But we wanted to share some of these results so that we can maybe create a larger area of that consistent message for demand. For Alaska seafood, we've learned that the definition of seafood is changing. Now the seafood consumer wants to know not only that when they purchase seafood it's good for them, but they also want to know that it's good for the planet. And so together, these are the attributes that are really defining and resonating with our consumer. Under the good for the planet category, the consumer really wants to love the wild. They want to support U.S. product. They want to support the harvesters of wild, in our case, seafood product, as well as the processors, and eventually, understand that they're supporting communities that rely on the economic stability of our sustainable, renewable resource. And so this is something that we can talk about in our marketing efforts, and obviously with aquaculture, you can talk about that as well in the future for really supporting the U.S. We're slowly seeing the consumer support sustainable fishing practices. And so that's where we, as marketers and producers of seafood, need to be able to support consistent education to the consumer to understand sustainable fishing practices and the eco-label, but most importantly, understand the origin of the seafood. People want to know where it's from. And then by educating the consumer, we're really encouraging that confidence that we want the seafood consumer to have, and then in the end, encouraging demand. And then as well, there's a growing demand for quality product that's responsibly sourced and utilized. As Michael was saying earlier, there's a great innovation right now going on in the seafood industry to be able to create more utilization of our seafood products. And we need to talk about that. That's something that's important for us to be able to relay to the consumer. We also need to be able to tell the story of our rather small environmental footprint compared to other protein competition. And then under the good for you category, the most important tenet of all is that our seafood tastes good. So often we only have one chance to be able to have a positive experience with a potential seafood consumer. And quality is the biggest part of that. And so by raising the bar on quality for seafood, we really are increasing the chance that all seafood can be a positive experience for a seafood consumer. Part of this is actually also with education for the consumer as well as culinary. So by being able to educate on how to prepare, how to cook, how to actually have a healthy, tasty meal. Work from SMP, work from Barton Seaver and his group to provide an education platform for culinary fields. That's where we can really move the needle on people becoming passionate and understanding how to work with seafood. Time over time, our consumer surveys also report back that when people choose to purchase seafood, they're purchasing it for a healthy choice. They want a healthy lifestyle. And so it's our job to be able to continue to amplify the message of SMP, to be able to have healthy be a part of not just the grams of omega-3 that we have in our seafood, but also how it actually affects a person when they consume it, that functional nutrition. We also need to be able to have a better understanding of how to, what we call flip to fish, which means there's an alternative to using another meat protein product. It's fish, and we want to be able to educate people on how to be able to do that. Another area that we are interested in looking at is when people choose a healthy choice, sometimes they look to plant-based diets. So we want to be able to educate on the synergies between seafood and plant-based healthy diets. And then last in this good for you category is seafood needs to be available in different product types and convenience forms. And this is an area that seafood has been slow to adapt to. However, we are seeing that there are changes happening. As Michael had on his slide, a picture of Love the Wild, having frozen food packaging that the consumer can experience education as well as an easy way to prepare really creates an easier and positive experience with seafood in different product forms. Additionally, our broadline distributors and food service partners want to be able to work with different portion sizes so it's convenient for their ability to be able to have seafood on their menu. So this is where we need to be able to be flexible and adapt to the changing market. Within all of these tenets, value is obviously an underlying component, and it's not to be overlooked, and it's definitely a challenge when it comes to comparing to other meat proteins in the market. However, we believe that, like I said, the demand part of seafood really has to be a collective effort from the seafood category. We want to be able to move the needle on increasing seafood consumption and truly find a place among other protein competitions. And so this is my last slide, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier with seafood production and consumption. And this looks at the U.S. meat production and meat consumption. And as you can see, we are a meat-consuming nation. We're ranked 3rd in meat production in the world and 5th in meat consumption. And so this is what we need to be able to address at forums like these, where we have such a great group together talking about seafood in general. Really being able to form what is our national story on seafood, and how do we be able to use that to be able to create demand and eventually be able to increase consumption in the U.S. for seafood. Thank you.